Don't embarrass me. Just sit quiet. That's what my son whispered to me as we walked into the grand hall that evening. His voice was low, clipped, and filled with irritation, as though I were some unruly child he needed to keep in line. I paused, stunned, but he didn't even look back. He straightened his tie, plastered on that confident smile of his, and strode forward to shake hands and slap backs, basking in the attention of his peers. I stood there for a moment, my chest tight, his words echoing in my ears. Don't embarrass me. Those words cut deeper than I can explain. Not because of their sharpness, but because of who they came from. The boy I raised, the man I had sacrificed decades for. I swallowed my pride and followed, taking a seat at the end of the long table, unnoticed, unacknowledged. All around me, glasses clinked, laughter bubbled, conversations filled the air. My son was in his element, bragging, charming, convincing everyone in the room that he was the shining star who held everything together. Then, halfway through the evening, the host, an older gentleman with a booming voice, stood and said, "Before we continue, I think we should recognize the true owner of this company. Would the founder please raise his hand?" The room quieted, eyes scanning. My son froze. He opened his mouth, perhaps ready to claim the credit himself. But before he could speak, I raised my hand. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Forks paused midair. Glasses hovered untouched. Every head turned to me, the old man at the end of the table, the one they'd been told to overlook. And in that moment, my son's confident smile collapsed into something I will never forget. Panic. But before I tell you what happened next, allow me to pause for a moment. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. I've found that betrayal has no borders. It touches people in small towns, big cities, across oceans. And if you've ever felt pushed aside, you'll understand my story. My name is Edward Hale, and I am 65 years old. I may look like just another aging man in a suit, but I've lived a lifetime most wouldn't trade places with. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And because through those hardships, I built something that mattered. I grew up with little more than calloused hands and a stubborn will. My father died young, my mother worked herself to exhaustion, and I learned early that if I wanted a future, I'd have to carve it out of stone. At 16, I worked 2 jobs, stocking shelves in the morning, hauling crates at night. By 20, I was scraping pennies together to rent a dingy office where I dreamed of starting a business. That business, the one I poured blood, sweat, and sleepless nights into, became a company. Not a giant empire, but a strong, steady firm that weathered storms, paid its workers, and stood tall for decades. And from the very beginning, everything I did was for my family, for my son. He was the reason I kept going on the nights when my back ached so badly I thought I'd collapse. He was the reason I signed away my own comfort, selling my car, pawning my watch, going without new clothes so I could keep the company alive. Every sacrifice had his future in mind. Every decision, every dollar saved or spent was tied to one hope, that my boy would have a life easier than mine. And for a time, I thought I succeeded. He went to good schools, wore nice clothes, traveled in ways I never could. He walked into the company on a silver road I had laid before him, greeted by doors that opened because of the reputation I had built. But as the years passed, I noticed something change in his eyes. Respect turned to condescension. Gratitude turned to entitlement. Where I saw sacrifice, he saw weakness. Where I saw legacy, he saw leverage. And so it was that night, sitting at the end of that glittering table, that I realized how far the distance between us had grown. My son wanted me invisible, silent, tucked away, erased from the story he was trying to write. A story where he was the hero, the genius, the rightful heir. But history cannot be rewritten by arrogance. Truth cannot be buried beneath pride. And when the host asked who owned the company, when all eyes searched the room, I did what I have always done. I stood in the truth of my labor. I raised my hand. The weight of that gesture was heavier than any speech I could have given. My son's eyes darted to me, wide with disbelief, his face draining of color. A murmur rippled across the table. Whispers carried from one guest to another. The old man wasn't just a guest. The old man was the reason they were all here. In that single moment, the mask my son had been wearing cracked. He had told me to sit quiet, but the truth was louder than his pride. I didn't come from money. I didn't inherit land, property, or connections. All I had was a pair of strong hands, a stubborn will, and a mother who refused to let me believe that poverty was destiny. We lived in a small 2-room house on the edge of town. My father died when I was 12, a heart attack that took him before his time. My mother scrubbed floors and washed laundry for other families just to keep bread on the table. I helped where I could, delivering newspapers before school, mowing lawns in the summer. I learned young that nothing is handed to you. If you want it, you fight for it. By 16, I was stocking shelves at the grocery store in the mornings, hauling crates at the loading dock in the evenings, and studying in between, determined not to let exhaustion kill my dreams. There were nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table, head on my textbooks, only to wake up at dawn and start again. Somewhere deep down, I knew this grind was temporary. I wasn't meant to spend my life clocking in for other men. I wanted something of my own, something I could build, grow, and hand down. That dream became a spark the day I met my late wife, Caroline. She believed in me before anyone else did. I still remember her smile when I told her I wanted to start a company. Most people laughed when I shared that idea. What did a poor boy with calloused hands know about business? But not Caroline. She just took my hand and said, "If anyone can do it, it's you." So I tried. I started small, so small that company might have been too generous a word. Just me, a desk salvaged from a junkyard, and a rented room above a tailor shop. I didn't even have a phone at first. I used the payphone on the corner to call potential clients, hoping someone would take a chance on me. The early years were brutal. I can't count how many nights I went without dinner so I could pay the electricity bill to keep the lights on in that little office. I sold my father's old watch, the only thing of value he left me, to cover a shipment we couldn't afford to miss. There were nights I came home to Caroline with nothing but apologies in my pockets, but she never complained. She'd just serve up beans and bread with a smile and tell me tomorrow would be better. And eventually it was. One client became 3. 3 became 10. Word spread. Edward Hale was a man who kept his promises, a man who worked until the job was done, a man who wouldn't cheat you. Slowly, we moved out of that tiny office and into something bigger. I hired help, first 1 man, then 2, then a dozen. Years passed, and the company grew roots. We weren't flashy. We weren't the kind of business that made the news. But we were steady, reliable, and honest. And in business, that's worth more than gold. I still remember the first Christmas after the company turned its first real profit. I came home with a bonus check in my pocket. Nothing huge by today's standards, but enough that we could finally buy a tree taller than me, real presents for the kids, and a proper dinner that didn't taste like sacrifice. Caroline cried that night, her head against my shoulder, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." From then on, every success felt like a brick in the foundation of something bigger than myself. I wasn't just building wealth. I was building a legacy, a future, something my children could inherit and be proud of. I worked through storms, through sickness, through sleepless nights. I worked when my back screamed, when my hands bled, when every part of me wanted to quit, because I knew the alternative. I had lived the hunger, the humiliation of having nothing. I swore my children would never know that. And they didn't. My son grew up in a warm house, with food on the table and clothes that weren't second-hand. He never knew the shame of being turned away at the store, because your family couldn't pay. He never went to bed hungry. He never saw his mother weep quietly over unpaid bills. He grew up with more than I ever had, because I gave him everything I never had. Back then, I thought that was enough. I thought sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. I thought sweat guaranteed respect. I thought that one day, when my son was grown, he would look at me and see the man who gave him the world, and he would honor that. But I was wrong. Respect is not inherited. Gratitude is not automatic. And no amount of sacrifice can change the heart of someone who decides they're entitled to more than they've earned. When my son told me to sit quiet at that dinner, when he made it clear he saw me as nothing more than an old embarrassment, I realized something. All those years of sweat and struggle had built a company, but they hadn't built the bond I thought we had. And in time, I would learn that the business I created to give him everything would become the very stage where he tried to erase me. Everything I built with my son in mind. When Caroline and I first brought him home from the hospital, I held him in my arms and made a silent vow. He would never grow up the way I did. He would never feel the gnaw of hunger, never wear shoes with holes in the soles, never look at other children's toys with envy. I swore he would have the life I had only dreamed of as a boy staring through shop windows. And so, I worked, not just for me, not just for Caroline, but for him. When he was little, I'd carry him around the office on my shoulders while I checked ledgers and made phone calls. He'd fall asleep on the couch with papers scattered around him while I pulled late nights. I used to think those moments would leave an impression, that one day he'd remember his father's determination and be proud. But pride doesn't always pass down the way you expect. As he grew, I tried to give him more than I ever had. When he was 10, I skipped buying a new winter coat for myself so he could have a proper bike. When he was 16, I sold my old truck to pay for the prep courses he wanted to take. When he was in college, I worked weekends, putting in extra hours, just so he wouldn't have to juggle jobs and classes the way I had. And when he stumbled, when he fell short, I was there. The first time he maxed out a credit card in college, I paid it off quietly, hoping it would be a lesson. When he lost thousands gambling online during his senior year, I covered the debt and told him, "We don't run from our mistakes, we fix them." When he called me in tears because he couldn't pay rent, I wired money without hesitation. Every time I told myself I was protecting him. Every time I thought, he'll see the sacrifices, he'll understand one day. But instead of gratitude, entitlement took root. He graduated into a company that had been waiting for him all along. The doors he walked through so confidently had been carved open by my hands, but he acted as though they'd always been wide and welcoming. He never knew the cold nights I spent praying the company would survive, the meals Caroline and I skipped so payroll could be met. He only knew the stability I had fought to build, and I let him. Because isn't that what fathers do? Isn't the point of sacrifice to shield your children from the storms you endured? But shielding has its price. Sometimes it blinds them to the storm entirely. I remember the first time I realized he was ashamed of me. It wasn't outright, not in words. It was at a high school event, parents invited, tables set up. I showed up straight from work, still in my coveralls, hands rough from a long day. When I waved, his smile faltered. He looked away, cheeks flushing. Later, he told me I should have changed first, that I embarrassed him. It stung, but I laughed it off. I told myself he was just a teenager, too caught up in appearances. I never imagined the same attitude would follow him into adulthood. Years later, when he joined the company, I thought things would change. I thought working side by side would show him what it truly meant to keep the business alive. I thought he'd look at the books, the long hours, the constant worries, and understand. But instead, he treated the company as his inheritance, not as the product of my labor. He enjoyed the title, the corner office, the respect from others. But respect for me, that dwindled year by year. Caroline used to tell me, "Edward, he'll grow out of it. Deep down, he knows what you've done." And I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But after she passed, the distance only grew wider. Without her warmth, there was nothing softening the edges between us. Still, I kept giving. When he wanted a down payment for his first home, I wrote the check. When he asked for control over certain accounts at the company, I agreed. When he suggested I step back for appearances, I nodded and let him play the role of the polished, modern executive while I became the background. But that background, those sacrifices, were the canvas of his success. Without me, there would have been no house to buy, no company to boast about, no reputation to polish. And yet, on the night of that dinner, he looked me in the eye and told me, "Don't embarrass me. Just sit quiet." Embarrass him, as if my presence, my existence, my history was a blemish on the image he wanted to project, as if the sweat that built his opportunities was shameful. In that moment, the weight of every sacrifice I had made pressed down on me. The nights I went hungry, the watch I pawned, the debts I paid, the tears Caroline shed, the life I had poured into building something so he could stand tall. And all he saw in me was an embarrassment. It was the cruelest cut a father could feel, not just being unappreciated, but being erased. Betrayal doesn't fall from the sky all at once. It creeps in, subtle, at first, so quiet you almost convince yourself you imagined it. That's how it began with my son. After he graduated and officially joined the company, I thought we'd finally be side by side, partners in building the legacy I had worked so hard to create. For the first year or two, things felt promising. He brought fresh energy, new ideas, a modern way of looking at problems. I was proud to see him take charge in meetings, proud to watch employees respect him, proud to think he was carrying the torch forward. But slowly, the tone shifted. At board meetings, when I offered advice, he would cut me off mid-sentence. "Dad, times are different now. We can't keep doing things your way." His words stung, not because change was bad, but because of the way he said them, with a sharpness that felt less like progress and more like dismissal. I'd sit there, my hands folded on the table, listening as he spoke over me, watching other board members glance awkwardly in my direction. Some of them had been with me since the beginning. They knew who built this company, yet they stayed quiet, perhaps sensing the tension between father and son, unwilling to step into the middle of it. Outside the office, the distance grew wider still. At family gatherings, he stopped introducing me as Dad, the man who started it all. Instead, I became my father, who used to run the place. Used to, as if I were already gone, a relic from another time. I remember one dinner when an investor approached us. He shook my son's hand enthusiastically, praising him for the company's success. My son smiled, nodding, soaking in the credit. I expected him to gesture toward me to say, "It was my father who built the foundation." But he didn't. He never even glanced my way. I stood there with a polite smile plastered on my face, but inside, a cold heaviness settled in my chest. I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't looking for glory. I just wanted acknowledgement, that all those years of sacrifice had meant something, that my role in shaping his future wasn't invisible. But invisibility became a pattern. He started holding meetings without me, claiming he didn't want to bother me with the details. He stopped asking my opinion on big decisions. When I did speak up, he'd sigh, his eyes sliding toward the ceiling like a teenager rolling his eyes at his parent. "Dad, this isn't the 80s. You don't understand how things work now." The words cut, because they weren't just dismissive of my ideas. They were dismissive of me. Still, I tried to convince myself it was just youth, just pride, just the natural tension between generations. Caroline used to remind me, "Edward, give him space. He's trying to prove himself." And maybe she was right. Maybe he was just trying to step out from under my shadow. But there's a difference between stepping out of someone's shadow and trying to erase the person casting it. The red flags grew bolder. One afternoon, I overheard him in the break room talking to younger employees. "Dad means well, but he doesn't really understand how things work anymore. He's just here for tradition." Tradition? As if decades of sweat, missed meals, and near bankruptcy were nothing more than an ornament on the company's wall. When he saw me standing in the doorway, his face didn't even flicker with shame. He just shrugged and said, "It's true, isn't it?" I walked away without answering. Sometimes silence is the only thing holding back the dam of anger. But silence doesn't erase the words. The final straw came at a client dinner. We were seated at a long, polished table, crystal glasses catching the light, silverware glinting under chandeliers. A potential partner asked about the company's origins. Before I could answer, my son jumped in. "It's a family business. I've been building it for years now." Building it. Years now. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I wanted to stand, to shout, to remind everyone in that room who had mortgaged their house to pay payroll, who had built the reputation brick by brick. But then my son leaned toward me, his voice a whisper meant only for me. "Don't embarrass me, Dad. Just sit quiet." Those words would return later, sharper, louder, but even in that moment they pierced me. Embarrass him. That's what he thought of me, the man who built his foundation, who sacrificed everything so he could sit at that glittering table. An embarrassment. I smiled weakly, keeping the peace, but inside I felt something crack. It wasn't a break yet, not a full betrayal, but it was the sound of distance widening, of respect fading, of a bond I once thought unshakable beginning to fray. And deep down, I knew, if I kept sitting quiet, he would erase me completely. It happened at one of those dinners where everything gleams, the kind where the silverware is polished so bright you can see your reflection, where wine glasses stand like crystal towers, and every man at the table wears a suit tailored so sharp it could cut. My son had arranged the event, a gathering of investors, clients, and colleagues, the kind of night where reputations are shaped with a smile and a handshake. I hadn't planned on going. These events drained me more than they used to. I'd rather be home with a warm fire and a quiet supper. But when my son insisted, "It'll look good if you're there, Dad. People like to see continuity." I agreed. Continuity. A living prop. A relic to decorate his narrative. I should have known what he meant. When we arrived, the room was already buzzing. Waiters in white shirts floated between tables, filling glasses. Laughter bounced off the marble floors. My son straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and leaned toward me just before we stepped inside. "Don't embarrass me. Just sit quiet." The words were a knife, whispered with a smile plastered on his face so no one else could hear. I froze for a moment, his voice echoing in my ears. Embarrass him? By existing? By being present in the company I had built? I followed him in, my steps heavier than they should have been. He glided from group to group, shaking hands, laughing loudly, telling stories. I stayed behind like a shadow, nodding politely when introduced but never invited into conversation. At the table, he took the seat of honor at the center. I was placed further down near the end, half hidden by a floral arrangement that smelled too strong. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for recognition. I was here because, in some twisted way, he thought my presence lent credibility to his performance. The dinner unfolded like theater. Speeches made, deals hinted at, promises whispered over wine. My son commanded the room with a confidence I couldn't deny. He had charisma, charm, the kind of presence that draws eyes. But what he didn't have, what no amount of charm could manufacture, was the foundation beneath it all. That was mine, my years, my sacrifices, my sweat. Halfway through the meal, one of the hosts, an older man with sharp eyes, raised his glass and said, "It's remarkable what your company has achieved. Who was it that started all this?" A hush fell, expectant. My fork paused mid-air. Here was the moment my son could acknowledge the truth, give me a nod, a gesture, a single sentence honoring the man who had given him everything. Instead, he smiled. "It's a family business," he said smoothly. "I've been building it for years now." The words hit me like a fist to the chest. Building it for years now. As if decades of my life had been wiped clean. As if the nights Caroline and I ate beans so the company could pay salaries had never happened. As if the times I pawned my watch, my coat, my pride had been nothing but shadows. The host glanced down the table toward me, curiosity flickering in his eyes. My son must have seen it too, because he leaned slightly in my direction and hissed under his breath, "Don't. Just sit quiet." That was the moment, the exact second the bond between us cracked beyond repair. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't stand and wave the truth like a banner. I sat there silent, my hand tightening around my napkin until it tore in half. I looked at him, my boy, my flesh and blood, and saw not the child I once carried on my shoulders, not the teenager who borrowed my truck, not the young man I bailed out of debt. I saw a stranger, a man who looked at me and saw nothing but a liability. The room moved on quickly. The host laughed, someone changed the subject, and soon the table buzzed again with stories and deals. But I didn't hear any of it. My son's words replayed in my head, on a loop. "Don't embarrass me. Sit quiet." When dessert was served, I excused myself early. I told the waiter I wasn't feeling well, and in truth, I wasn't. I walked outside into the cold night, the laughter still spilling out behind me, and leaned against the stone wall of the building. My breath came out in clouds, shaky, uneven. For the first time in my life, I felt invisible. Not just ignored, not just sidelined, but erased. My son had taken the company I built and painted himself as its sole architect, and he had told me to sit silent while he did it. As I stood there in the cold, I touched the cufflinks on my sleeves. Caroline had given them to me the year our company turned its first real profit. "A reminder," she had said, "that you earn this." I held them now, my thumb tracing the metal, and I whispered into the night, "What would you say, Caroline, if you saw what he's become?" The wind gave no answer. But in my heart, I knew, if I stayed silent forever, I would lose not just my company, but myself. That night, I drove home in silence. The city lights blurred in my vision, not from the rain on the windshield, but from the weight pressing behind my eyes. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white, as though holding on harder would somehow stop the ache tearing through my chest. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked darker than ever. Caroline's flowers by the porch had long since wilted. Her laughter no longer echoed in the hallways. Without her, the house was just wood and brick, hollow and cold. She had been the heart of it, the light that made sacrifices bearable. I sat in the car for a long time before going in. The humiliation replayed in my mind like a cruel film. My son's confident smile as he took credit, his eyes darting to me with that sharp whisper, "Don't embarrass me, sit quiet," and me obeying. Sitting there while the room moved on, invisible, erased. Inside, I hung up my coat, loosened my tie, and sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and unbothered, as though time didn't care about betrayal. I stared at the empty chair across from me, the one Caroline used to fill with her warmth, and whispered, "What would you say to me tonight?" Her voice wasn't there, of course, but I remembered her words from years ago, when the company was still fragile, when bills stacked higher than profits and I nearly gave up. "Edward," she had said, "you built this from nothing. Never let anyone make you feel small for that, not even your own blood." I pressed my palms against the table, my breath shaking. Had I let him make me small? Had I spent decades giving him everything only to end up as an embarrassment in his eyes? The memories came in waves. The nights I worked through Christmas so payroll would be met. The time I sold my father's watch to cover a shipment. The mornings I kissed Caroline goodbye before sunrise, only to stumble home after midnight. The meals we skipped, the debts we paid, the tears she wiped from my face when I thought it was all going to collapse. And for what? So my son could stand in a glittering hall in front of strangers and pretend the sweat, the sacrifices, the hunger never happened? So he could silence me with a whisper, as though I were a child who didn't know his place? I clenched my jaw, the ache in my chest deepening. Where did I go wrong? I muttered into the empty kitchen. I had loved him with everything I had. Every choice I made, every long night, every sacrifice was for him, for his future. And now he looked at me as if I were a burden, a relic, a liability to be hidden. For a moment, despair nearly swallowed me whole. Maybe this was the way of things. Maybe fathers always became irrelevant to their sons, shadows fading in the background. Maybe it was my fate to sit silent, erased from the very story I wrote with my own hands. But then my eyes fell on the cufflinks Caroline had given me, still glinting faintly under the kitchen light. My thumb traced the metal, the memory of her voice ringing in my head. Never let anyone make you feel small. Something stirred inside me then. Not anger, not yet, just the faintest seed of resolve. I realized humiliation can only destroy you if you let it take root. My son had humiliated me, yes. He had cut me down, yes. But the truth still existed, whether he acknowledged it or not. And truth, once spoken, has a power arrogance can never silence. I stood, walking to the old filing cabinet in my study. The drawers squeaked as I pulled them open, one after another, sifting through stacks of papers, contracts, receipts, incorporation documents, the foundation of everything. There it was, the original company incorporation file. My name, bold across the page, the founder and majority owner. I held it in my hands, my heart pounding. This was the truth my son wanted to bury. But it was here, real, undeniable. I whispered into the quiet of the study as though Caroline could hear me still. He told me to sit quiet, but I won't, not anymore. The weight in my chest didn't vanish, but it shifted. Less despair, more determination. The humiliation still stung, but beneath it, a new strength began to rise. I returned to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat back down. The silence of the house no longer felt like defeat. It felt like preparation. Because humiliation is only the beginning. What you do after determines whether you remain broken or whether you rise. And I knew, for the first time in a long time, that I wasn't going to stay broken. If that dinner had been the only insult, perhaps I could have forgiven it. Perhaps I could have told myself my son was stressed, caught up in appearances, desperate to impress. But what happened next proved it wasn't just a moment of poor judgment. It was a pattern. His arrogance didn't fade after that night. It grew bolder. Within weeks, I noticed him stepping further into the spotlight. Every event, every meeting, every interview, he made sure he was the one in control, the one answering questions, the one smiling for photographs. At first, I told myself it was fine. Let him take the attention. Let him shine. I didn't crave the spotlight anymore. But then I started hearing the words whispered in hallways, words muttered at the golf course, words repeated in the cafe downtown where old colleagues gathered. Isn't it remarkable what he's built? He's really turned the company around. I didn't realize his father wasn't even part of it anymore. Every time I overheard one of those comments, my chest tightened. It wasn't just that they credited him. It was that they erased me entirely. My name, my history, my sacrifices, reduced to a footnote no one remembered. One afternoon, I sat quietly in the back during a company presentation. The room was packed with employees, some new, some who had been with us for decades. My son stood at the front, slides glowing behind him, speaking with the ease of a man who believed every word. Our company, he said, has always been about innovation. I've spent years making sure we lead in our industry. When I took the reins, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to build something lasting. I felt the words like blows. When I took the reins, I've spent years building this. Not once did he mention the man who mortgaged his home to pay for those first shipments. Not once did he mention the nights I slept on the office floor to meet deadlines. Not once did he mention the foundation I had laid long before he even stepped foot into the building. And worse, the employees applauded. Some of them had been there when the company nearly collapsed. They had seen me bleed for this business. But even they clapped, smiling, as though rewriting history didn't sting them. Perhaps it was easier to cheer for the young, polished son than for the old man in the back of the room. I left before the presentation ended, my shoulders heavy, my heart aching. Later that week, a longtime client called me directly. "Edward," he said, "I didn't realize you'd fully stepped away. Your son's been telling everyone he's been running the show for years now." Fully stepped away. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the family photo on my desk. In it, my son was just a boy, grinning with missing teeth, his hand clutching mine. I wondered what had happened to that boy. The boy who once begged to ride in my truck, who sat on my shoulders to watch fireworks, who looked at me like I hung the moon. Somewhere along the line, that boy had become a man who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle. The arrogance seeped into his personal life, too. At social gatherings, he introduced himself as the man behind the company, as though I were long gone. I heard from neighbors that he bragged about taking things to the next level after Dad retired, though I had never retired. I was still on the board, still the majority shareholder, still present. But presence means nothing if the world no longer sees you. Each slight chipped away at me. Each whisper, each dismissal, each lie presented as fact. It was like death by 1,000 cuts. One evening, after hearing yet another story about my son claiming credit for our success, I sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the horizon. The field stretched out before me, steady, unchanging, while my heart felt anything but steady. I clenched my fists, the words repeating in my head, "Don't embarrass me. Sit quiet." But humiliation can only last so long before it transforms into something else. As I sat there in the fading light, I realized silence was not protecting me. It was destroying me. Every time I let him erase me, every time I sat quiet, I gave him permission to continue. And if I didn't stand up soon, the story of my life's work would no longer belong to me at all. The arrogance of my son was not just hurting me, it was rewriting history. And I wasn't about to let that stand. The night I realized silence was no longer an option, I found myself pacing the study like a man haunted by ghosts. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. But inside me, everything was loud. My son's voice rang over and over. I've spent years building this company. When I took the reins, lies, polished until they sounded like truth. Lies so big that people clapped for them. I sat heavily in the chair at my old oak desk, its surface scratched from decades of use. I pulled open the drawers and began rummaging. Old papers, receipts, ledgers, each one a relic of battles fought long ago. My hands shook as I searched, not from weakness, but from something rising inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, purpose. And then I found it. The file folder was worn, the edges frayed, but the documents inside were intact. Company and corporation papers, ownership records, contracts signed by my own hand. My name, Edward Hale, stamped across every page. Founder, majority shareholder, sole controller of the direction of the business. I stared at those words for a long time. Founder, majority shareholder. Words that carried the weight of truth, the kind of truth arrogance could not erase. I thought of Caroline. I could almost hear her voice, soft and firm at the same time. Edward, you built this from nothing. Don't you dare let him take it away with words. I closed my eyes, the paper trembling in my grip. For weeks, humiliation had been my shadow. For weeks, I'd convinced myself that maybe I deserved invisibility, that maybe it was just the way of things for sons to replace fathers. But the truth lay in my hands now. I wasn't obsolete. I wasn't erased. I was still the rightful owner. The next morning, I made a call I should have made long ago. Richard, I said, when my lawyer picked up the phone. My voice was steady, but my heart pounded. It's time. Richard Evans had been with me for decades, through contracts, disputes, expansions. He was a man of detail, calm where I was fiery. He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Bring the papers. We'll get this sorted." When I walked into his office later that day, the air smelled of old leather and ink. Stacks of files lined the shelves, the kind of order only a lawyer could appreciate. Richard looked up from his desk, adjusted his glasses, and gave me a small smile. "Edward," he said, "you look like a man who's tired of being quiet." I nodded, sliding the folder across his desk. "My son has been parading around like he owns the company. He tells people I'm retired. He tells me not to embarrass him. I've had enough. I need to make sure he can't erase me." Richard opened the file, scanning with practiced eyes. He hummed softly as he turned the pages, then leaned back in his chair. "This is clear. The company is still legally yours. You hold controlling shares. He's a manager, nothing more. Legally, he can't move a stone without your approval." I exhaled, tension releasing from my chest. But Richard wasn't done. "If he's spinning a story publicly," he continued, "you'll want to secure this airtight. We can restructure ownership documents, update the board filings, and set up protections so he can't sell or transfer anything without your consent. We can even prepare a trust, something that ensures the company goes where you want it after you're gone, not where he decides." I leaned forward. "A trust for my grandchildren. They deserve a future. He doesn't deserve to squander it." Richard nodded, scribbling notes. "It can be done. Quietly, effectively, legally. But Edward, when the moment comes, you'll have to be ready. This isn't just paperwork. This is truth colliding with arrogance. He won't take it quietly. I looked him straight in the eye. I've been quiet long enough. We spent the next 2 hours combing through documents, updating signatures, preparing safeguards. With each stroke of the pen, with each paper notarized, I felt the humiliation of the past weeks lifting. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was acting. I was no longer the man sitting in silence at the end of a dinner table. I was the man reclaiming the story that was mine. When I left Richard's office, the winter air felt sharp against my face, but I breathed it in like a man starved. For the first time in weeks, my steps were lighter. My shoulders were straight. I carried the folder under my arm like a weapon, not of violence, but of truth. Driving home, I realized something. Dignity doesn't vanish because someone refuses to see it. It vanishes only if you give it away. And I was done giving it away. He told me not to embarrass him. But soon, he would learn that the only embarrassment was building your legacy on lies. Preparation has a weight to it. It isn't as loud as confrontation. It doesn't come with applause or gas. It's quieter, steadier, like sharpening a blade in the dark while your enemy boasts at the feast. That's what those days felt like. Days of sharpening. Richard and I met 3 more times over the following weeks. His office became the forge where my resolve turned into action. He spread the documents out across his desk. Share certificates, incorporation files, tax filings. Every page carried my name, stamped and notarized, undeniable in its authority. With each sheet we reviewed, my son's false narrative unraveled. "Here's what we'll do," Richard explained, sliding a document toward me. "We'll restructure voting rights so no major decision can be made without your explicit approval. We'll amend the board charter to reflect your continued control. And this," he tapped another file, "is the trust. Your grandchildren will be the beneficiaries, not your son. That way your legacy skips arrogance and lands in innocent hands." I read the papers carefully, my pen trembling slightly as I signed. Trembling not with doubt, but with the gravity of it all. These weren't just signatures. They were declarations. They were me reclaiming my place in the story. After the 3rd meeting, Richard leaned back in his chair and studied me. "Edward, you understand what this means. When the truth comes out, your son's pride will take a fall. He may rage, he may lash out, but the law will hold. Are you ready for that storm?" I met his gaze. My voice came steady. "Richard, I've weathered storms all my life. I built this company in the middle of one. I'm not afraid of a little thunder." Still, in the quiet moments at home, I felt the weight of what was coming. The company wasn't just papers and profits. It was blood and years, sweat and sacrifice. And now it was the battlefield where father and son would clash. Some nights, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cufflinks Caroline had given me, the ones I wore when the company turned its first profit. I would run my thumb over their smooth surface and whisper, "I'm doing this for us, for what we built." He may have forgotten, but I haven't. Other nights, I walked the halls of the house, remembering Christmas mornings when my son tore into presents with wide eyes, birthdays where he blew out candles while I stood behind the camera, proud. The memories cut deep. Love doesn't vanish just because respect does. And that was the hardest part. I still loved him. Even as he erased me, I still loved him. But love doesn't mean surrender. One evening, Richard called. "Edward, the gala is next week." He'll be there, of course. All the investors, the clients, the partners. If you want the truth revealed, that's your stage. I looked out the window at the field stretching beyond my home, bathed in the pale light of the moon. "Then that's where it will happen," I said. In the days leading up to the event, I prepared the way a soldier might prepare for battle. Not with armor or weapons, but with clarity. I polished my shoes, pressed my best suit, made sure the documents were neatly organized in the leather folder Richard had given me. But more than that, I prepared my heart. I practiced the words I would say, not in anger, but in truth. I reminded myself I wasn't walking in there to humiliate my son. He had humiliated himself by building his reputation on lies. I was walking in there to reclaim dignity, to protect a legacy, to ensure the truth stood taller than arrogance. On the morning of the gala, I woke early. The house was quiet, sunlight just beginning to filter through the curtains. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the cufflinks Caroline had given me all those years ago. My reflection stared back at me. Not the tired old man my son thought I was, but the founder, the builder, the man who had carved a company out of nothing. I smiled faintly. "Let's finish this," I whispered. When I arrived at Richard's office to pick him up, he looked me over and nodded. "You look like a man ready to remind the world who he is." I tightened my grip on the folder under my arm. Not remind, prove. And as we drove toward the gala, my heart was steady. The time for silence was over. The time for truth had come. The gala was a sea of glitter and gold. Chandeliers cast their glow across polished marble, and laughter floated like smoke in the air. Waiters glided between tables with trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres. Everywhere I looked, the powerful and the polished gathered, talking numbers, markets, futures. And there, in the center of it all, was my son. He wore the kind of suit that screamed confidence, his smile sharp, his handshake firmer than ever. He moved from group to group like a politician, shaking hands, slapping backs, commanding attention. And why wouldn't he? For months he'd been painting himself as the architect of the company. Tonight, he was the star. Richard walked beside me as we entered, his briefcase in hand. His voice was steady. "Remember, Edward, you don't need to raise your voice. The truth will raise it for you." I nodded, gripping the folder under my arm. My heart was calm in a way it hadn't been in weeks. As we took our seats, I noticed I'd been placed at the far end of the table again, half hidden like a prop trotted out for nostalgia. My son stood near the center, basking in the spotlight. He began his speech with ease. "Our company," he said, "has always been about progress, about innovation. I've poured myself into this business, ensuring it thrives in the modern world." Applause rippled through the room. I caught Richard's glance. Not yet. My son continued, weaving his narrative with practiced charm. "When I took the reins, I knew it would be difficult. But through hard work and determination, we've built something remarkable. When I took the reins." My jaw tightened, but I remained silent. Then came the moment. The host, a distinguished man with gray hair and a commanding voice, rose with his glass in hand. "Before we continue, I think it's only right to recognize the true owner of this fine company. Would the founder please raise his hand?" The room stilled. Forks hovered. Glasses paused midair. Eyes swept the table. For a split second, my son froze. His confident smile flickered, his eyes darting around, calculating. His lips parted as if to claim the title for himself. And that's when I raised my hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Dozens of eyes shifted to me, the man at the far end of the table, the one they thought was just there for show. Murmurs rippled like waves across the room. I rose slowly, the folder in my hand. My voice was calm, measured, but every syllable carried weight. "That would be me. My name is Edward Hale. I built this company from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, sacrifice by sacrifice. And while my son has worked here, make no mistake, ownership has never left my hands." Gas. A few sharp intakes of breath. The air felt charged, like a storm breaking. My son shot to his feet, his face pale, his smile gone. "Dad, sit down. Don't do this." But I wasn't sitting anymore. I laid the folder on the table, opening it to reveal the incorporation documents, ownership records, all notarized and signed. Richard stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "Legally, Mr. Hale is the founder and majority shareholder. Any claims otherwise are false. Tonight, the truth is on record." The host leaned forward, scanning the documents with wide eyes. Around the room, whispers swelled. "So it was him all along. He's the founder." My son's voice cracked as he tried to recover. "I run the company day to day. Everyone knows that." I looked at him, my gaze steady. "Running it is not owning it, and taking credit for sacrifices you never made is not leadership. It's theft." The words landed like blows. My son staggered back, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between me, the documents, and the stunned faces around the table. The humiliation was complete. His arrogance, his narrative, his false pride, all stripped away in a single moment of truth. I closed the folder, my voice low but final. "You told me not to embarrass you. But son, you embarrassed yourself when you erased the man who gave you everything. Tonight, the truth spoke louder than your pride." The room erupted, not in applause, not in celebration, but in murmurs, gasps, and stares that told everyone where the respect truly belonged. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. The gala ended, not with fanfare, but with whispers trailing like smoke in the night. My son left early, his face flushed, his pride shattered. He avoided my eyes, his shoulders stiff as he stormed out. Richard patted my shoulder as we stepped into the cold air. "You did well, Edward. You didn't just reclaim the company. You reclaimed yourself." The words lingered with me as we drove home. In the weeks that followed, the ripples spread. Clients called to congratulate me, some even apologizing for believing my son's version of events. Employees who had been silent came forward, thanking me for building the company they relied on. Investors looked at me with renewed respect, reminded of the foundation beneath the gloss. And my son? He went quiet. The arrogance that once filled every room was gone, replaced by a silence of his own making. He still came to the office, but the swagger was gone. He avoided conversations, avoided eye contact. The humiliation had branded him. I didn't rejoice in it. A father never truly rejoices in his child's downfall. Even now, my love for him remained, stubborn and unyielding. But love without respect is a hollow thing, and I had finally stopped allowing myself to be hollowed out. Richard and I finalized the trust. The company's future was secured for my grandchildren, untainted, protected, shielded from arrogance. My son would no longer hold the keys to undo what I had built. The legacy was safe. One afternoon, weeks later, I walked through the office alone. The halls smelled faintly of coffee and ink, the hum of printers steady. I ran my fingers along the wall, remembering the early days when the paint was peeling, when desks were second-hand, when every small victory felt like a miracle. I stopped by the old break room where I once ate cold sandwiches, while calculating numbers on the back of napkins, and I smiled. Not because those days were easy, but because they were mine. They were the proof of my labor, the story no one could erase. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold. The air was crisp, the world quiet. I thought of Caroline, of the promise I had made her, of the cufflinks still gleaming on my sleeves. "I did it," I whispered into the wind. "I protected what we built." And for the first time in a long while, the ache in my chest eased. I had lost something. Yes, the respect of a son who chose arrogance over gratitude. But I had gained something greater, the certainty that my dignity remained intact, that my legacy would outlast lies, and that my voice, once silenced, had spoken louder than pride. As I finish telling you this, I want to leave you with a truth. Respect is not inherited, it is earned. And no amount of arrogance, no amount of rewriting, no amount of whispered "sit quiet" can erase the labor of an honest life. Because when the host asked, "Who owns this? Company?" I didn't sit silent. I raised my hand.